taught aerobics in the 80s.
All right, everybody, we are live and welcome to our December live Craftsy Chat. Colette and I have already been chatting as we were getting ready to get going, but I would like to introduce myself to some of you. This might be the first time you're seeing me. My name is Leah, and I do have with me the wonderful pastry chef, Colette Christian. She's here to answer all of your questions today. And before we dig in, I would just like to remind you that there is a free download for you today. You can find the best pie and crust recipes from Craftsy. That's a download in the video description, or if you keep an eye on the chat box, our team behind the scenes is going to slide that link in there for you to click as well. We have gathered some great recipes for you and would love for you to try them out. And then, of course, I am here to ask Colette your pastry questions. So my main job is to keep an eye on that chat box, send them into the chat box below the video or in your comment section, and I will feed those questions along to her as we go. With that said, it is time to bring Colette on. Hello, Colette. How are you doing?
Hi, Leah. I am doing great. So nice to see you. So nice to see everybody. And I'm looking forward to answering those questions.
All right. Any beginning thoughts you'd like to start us out with before we dig in?
I just hope that everyone is doing well and staying safe and healthy and inspired to do some holiday baking. Might be doing a little bit smaller portions since we're being mindful and not gathering in big groups, but we're still baking, and that's all that matters.
Absolutely. All right, I'm going to start getting into these questions now. So as always, keep them coming. We will get to as many as we can in the time that we have. And we are starting with a question here from Amy. So Amy is asking, are there general guidelines for which types of pies require pre-baking the crust?
Amy, that's a great question. Yes, custard-based pies respond well to par baking or pre-baking the crust. So what you want to do is blind bake that crust just until it's opaque, really very little color on it. Take it out, let it cool a little bit, and then like your pumpkin pie fillings, pecan pie fillings, those types of pies, even a quiche, if you're doing a savory quiche for the holidays, can benefit from pre-baking that crust. What it does, when a filling is very liquid, if the crust is pre-baked and set a little bit, then that liquidy filling tends to not leach into the crust and make things soggy.
All right, and there's a follow-on from Amy as well, thinking about getting some baking gadgets like pie weights and shields. Do you have any recommendations on how to choose those?
Ooh, I have big opinions on pie weights and shields. First of all, no shade to the pie weight manufacturers. There are some beautiful pie weights out there at the cookware stores and online sources. However, you don't need to spend that money. You could spend money on your baking supplies, on other things, and instead, just when you're in the supermarket, buy a bag of kidney beans or pinto beans, mix them half and half with rice, and then that will make a great sort of grocery store pie weights that won't cost you very much, and they fit perfectly into the shape of the pie. Now, one more thing. When the best liner to use in between any pie weight and your pie crust is a crumpled up piece of parchment paper, not foil, because the crumpled parchment paper conforms beautifully to your pie shell and it's environmentally friendly.
Perfect. And then a follow-on coming from Annette here. You mentioned blind baking. What is blind baking?
Oh, and Leah, I didn't address the pie shields. So if we could just go back and then please hold the blind baking definition in just on the back burner. Okay, pie shields. My issue with pie shields is that they clamp on, well, clamp is a strong word. They rest on the edge of your pie because oftentimes our pie crusts, our edges take on caramelization and crust color before our pie is done. Because pies take Pies can take, a large pie can take up to an hour of baking time. So here's my hack pie shield. And that is a piece of aluminum foil folded into a square with the shiny side in the center. And where those four folds meet, you folded it into quarters. Where there's four folds meet, you trim those corners and you get a small hole. Shiny side down, drape that lightly over your pie and put it back in the oven. Now, convection bakers, you'll need the fan off using the foil tent, but I started doing that, I don't know, like 15 years ago after a very long conversation with a home economist on the Reynolds Wrap hotline. Yes, I'm that kind of a geek who calls hotlines like that and asks the hard questions, so you don't have to. The shiny side conducts more heat than the dull side, not by much, but just by a little. That's why it's shiny side down. And you never have your crust edges are always beautiful and intact. Woo, sorry. Okay, Leah, now why blind bake?
Yes.
Or what is blind baking?
Exactly.
It is a way to pre-bake your pastry crust so that particularly liquid fillings do not leach into the crust and make it soggy. Because once that excess moisture gets into your crust, there's no baking it out. It's there. Now, some people don't mind. They kind of like that little sort of that, and I don't mean this in a bad way, that soggy texture. We've kind of become very used to it. But once you try blind baking, like with a pumpkin pie or a custard pie, you'll find it's really delightful to have a crisper pastry underneath your beautiful, soft and custardy filling.
All right, that is blind baking.
Yes.
There are actually a couple questions about blind baking and about using foil filled with dry beans or split peas and things like that. So hopefully we've covered a lot just with those first couple of questions. I'm going to move into a different question topic here with Yura's question. What is the difference between pastry flour and cake flour? And when and how can I substitute them for all-purpose flour?
Great question. It's all a matter of protein content. So cake flour has the lowest amount of protein. And you might be thinking, flour and protein, what are you talking about? Well, the composition of flour is pretty much almost all starch, but wheat that is grown in colder climates under harsher conditions, and then specific varieties are also selected. There are 6,000 different strains of wheat that can be grown. So there's a lot to choose from. But growers select strains of wheat, and the harsher the climate, the higher the protein content. So those are flours we use for breads, for bagels, for pasta. Now, pastry flour is 7 to 9% protein content, so it's lower. Bread flour can be anywhere between 11 to 15, and 15 is the highest end. Okay, so not to get too confusing, so your pastry flour at 7 to 9% is in between cake and all-purpose. Cake being 6 to 8% protein, and that protein contributes to structure. We would use pastry flour in a pastry because we want that melt in the mouth texture. So the lower protein content helps us with that. Now, all-purpose flour is a blend, and all-purpose flour was created so that restaurants and hotels and home bakers did not have to have 4 flours on their pantry shelf. So all-purpose flour can usually be used for all recipes that use pastry flour. So that's cake flour is cakes only. You use it, well, there are exceptions for everything, but you find if you try to sub it, just generally, your product will have, unless it's a cake, will have less structure than maybe you're looking for.
All right, great. And this is a really fantastic follow on. Lorraine's question comes next. What is the best type of flour to use for pie dough and why?
I believe, and this is not because I love them, because I do love them, but King Arthur all-purpose flour, unbleached, is my go-to. And the reason I like it is they are very aware of their growers and where their wheat is coming from, and it is naturally processed, as minimally processed as a mainstream flour can be. That doesn't mean that there aren't good brands out there, and maybe you have a local mill and it's really great to experiment with different flours and definitely local flours. But as a mainstream brand, that one is one that I really like. And Gold Medal also makes a very good unbleached all-purpose flour. But the key point in all this is for your pie dough, you want to make sure that your flour is unbleached. Make sure, and it will say that on the package. Some lesser brands or more generic brands of all-purpose will be bleached. And so you want to be very mindful of that. I hope I answered that properly.
I think so. I think that was very helpful. I know I learned something with that one too. Let's go to Michelle's question next. This is taking us a little bit back into blind baking. So Michelle has tried everything: pie weights, cooling, freezing, not stretching the dough, docking, etc. The shell always seems to shrink. Any suggestions you've got, Colette, would be helpful to Michelle.
Michelle, I think it's in your mixing. And as a matter of fact, I think we have access to this. We can put the link in, we can provide the link. But in November, I did a live tutorial on pie dough. And if you go back and watch that, I think you might be over mixing. And when it will be very helpful. Here, let me try to finish my sentences. It will be very helpful to watch just even the mixing portion of the demo, because I demo how to minimally mix your dough. Because what happens if we're over mixing our dough at all, we're activating the gluten in the flour. There's two proteins in wheat flour, glutenin and gliadin. And when they are agitated by any kind of mixing, even stirring or kneading or in a mixer, after they've been exposed to some kind of moisture, then gluten strands form. When we make bread, we want a lot of structure and a lot of gluten development. But for our pie pastry, we want, again, melt in the mouth, luscious texture. So we want to mix as little as possible. So I recommend just viewing that part of the video where we keep it really light in our mixing.
All right. And if you're just joining us, I did see a really recent question pop into the chat. Yes, there are tons of questions that are going into our chat box. Colette is answering those questions live. So if you are looking for the answers to the questions, they're not going to be typed in as answers, although our team, like Colette just called out, does slide in some links and things that could be useful for you to click on, including that free download that you can look for. But if you're looking for the answers to the questions, that's what Colette is doing for us right here live. So if you have a question for her, go ahead and drop it in the chat box. As usual, we're going to get to as many as possible. So we are going to move on to another question next, and this one is about self-rising flour. So a guest is asking, when a recipe calls for all-purpose flour, salt, and baking soda, can you substitute self-rising flour?
It's tricky. Yes and no. You can, but often the proportion or ratio of baking powder and salt that is added to a bag of self-rising flour may be not enough leavener or salt for your recipe. So if you have a tried and true biscuit recipe and you've been using, let's say, I just immediately a famous biscuit flour, white lily, pops into my head and it works every time, then fine. But if you're accessing a new recipe, then it would be best to go to, if you're your self-rising flours website, and on the website or in the, if you can contact them, they have, you need to find out exactly per cup how much they have added baking powder and salt to, and um, and then you might have to adjust the recipe you're currently making by adding a little bit more salt and a little bit more baking powder.
Okay, I'm taking a look at our next question here. This is a good one, coming in from Elowin. I believe I'm saying that correctly. Username Elowin. Some shop-bought fruit pies have a sweet pastry case, almost like a sort of a soft shortbread taste and texture. I've tried sweet pastry recipes, but they're not the same. What recipe should I be looking for to recreate that type of pastry, please?
It would be a pie crust that has a, a fair amount, and that sounds dramatic. It will have some sugar in it, maybe up to, not to jump into baker's percentages, everybody, but I would say it would have 12, it would have, you would be looking at something that would have a recipe that would have at least an ounce, ounce and a half, maybe even up to 2 ounces, which would be like 4 tablespoons, a quarter cup of sugar into in the recipe. I have to apologize. I am such, I really have to think now about volume measures because I work so much in weight that it takes me, like I feel like I'm translating languages. So again, a fair amount of sugar for that is what you would be looking for to give that sweetness. Whereas if we look at pie recipes, even the one that I did in the demo, the amount of sugar is minimal. But because a lot of store-bought pies, they up the sugar because there's quite a belief that we have a palate that goes toward more sweetness. So higher sugar.
All right, we have another more general question next. This one comes in from Patricia. Patricia wants to know if she can use almond flour or what that might be good for.
Almond flour is great for macarons, and it's great for many cakes. But as a general question, it is a lifesaver in gluten-free pastry baking, but it has no gluten. So where it does provide some structure, it's not, you can't one for one it with wheat flour. I hope that helps.
All right. If you have any more specific questions, always drop those back into the chat as well. We've got 2 comments right in a row and then a question following on. A couple people watching. Just enjoy your classes so much, Colette, and really find you to be a wonderful teacher. Both of them are asking how you're doing, how you are feeling, and then there's a follow on about what new classes you are planning for Craftsy.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you so much for enrolling in my classes, and I'm so glad you enjoy them. My goal is to always is to be accessible and as clear as possible. So I'm glad that it's working, and I'm doing great. Thank you. I'm really feeling and doing quite well, and just the ideas to produce more content and to just keep keep going is. I wake up with new ideas every day, so I don't really have anything in anything scheduled, but hopefully once we get clear of COVID and we can get back in the studio, then we'll be producing more content. And if there's anything that you would like to see in particular, especially after all we've been through, please, you can find me on. You can put them in the chat here. You can even find me on social media. Let us know, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, because totally open to as many ideas and as possible.
Awesome. Yes, of course. We like to crowdsource some things to know what you're looking for and you are excited about out there. So absolutely do let us know. Find Colette on social media, just like she said. Let's move on to another question here. This one's from Helena. Can non-dairy butter, like Earth Balance or Mayokos, I believe, be used to make croissants?
Absolutely. You can make delicious croissants with the Earth Balance butter. I haven't tried I don't know how to say that, Mayonos. I haven't tried that one yet, but I have tried Earth Balance, because with all these years with croissant and laminated dough questions on Craftsy, that has come up a lot. And so the process is the same, except it may soften more quickly. And if that happens, you may find yourself working a little bit more in and out of the freezer than the refrigerator. And as always, and that's one thing I did want to point out, your questions are being answered. So please feel free to put that question, like if you're watching the Classic Croissants Modern Methods, make sure to ask those questions. The technique is all the same. You would just use like an unsweetened almond milk for the dairy in the dough, and your butter block would be the Earth Balance, or try the other one, which I can't say. It might work. Try one, try both. Keep notes and let us know.
All right. And like Colette just said, we were actually talking about this a little bit before we went live. The questions that you're talking about inside the classes, did you want to specify what exactly, if you are participating in a Craftsy class, how those questions could be utilized for you?
Oh, for me?
Well, for you, the viewers, could you specify to them how they could use those questions?
Oh, absolutely. For one thing, the previous questions are listed and they can be very informative as well. And I guess my point is, don't be shy. If you have a question in a class, go ahead and ask it, and it will be answered. So I guess just confidence in the question asking process on Craftsy. Be confident.
And as somebody who does a lot of reading questions and events just like this one, I promise you, if you have the question, somebody else out there also does too. So don't be afraid to ask. I know someone will be appreciative that you put that question in. All right, speaking of questions, let's move to the next one. Let's go to Melissa next. Melissa says, hi, is my dough supposed to be crumbly or stretchy once I roll out? I cannot get it to roll onto the rolling pin to place on my pie dish without it breaking or tearing into pieces.
Melissa, it needs more moisture. Normally, bakers will add too much moisture, but I think you're stopping a little short of getting moisture either into the dough or specifically through the dough. When we're mixing a pie dough, what we're actually doing is we are, this is going to sound like too much, but we're actually folding and pushing the hydration into the starch granules in the flour. So not to get too techno, but so that's the thing with pie dough, why it can be so frustrating and tricky. It's like a dance. We want to mix it enough so the moisture gets in, but not so much that we over mix it. So again, if you have the time, just even the mixing portion of the demo that I did pre-Thanksgiving, I think will be very, very helpful. In my on-ground classes, which I taught for years, I honed this technique of how to add the liquid to a pie dough. When you're initially mixing, you add it on top. And if you have to add a little extra, you add it around the side of the semi-cohesive mass of dough that you have created at that point. And I think that that's a game changer. I don't know where and when it came to me, but it's been very successful for years. So just finding that balance, Melissa, between just the right amount of liquid and not too little.
All right, let's go on to next question here about low carb flours. So, hi, chef. Any tips and recipes about using low carb flours such as carbulose? Thanks in advance.
Wow, I'm going to be honest. I am such an old-fashioned girl that I don't have and especially since since all the changes we've been through, I have not used them. So I would not be I am not the expert for you here, and I'm going to be honest about that. So I apologize. Pre-pandemic, pre-shutdown, pre-all this, I was beginning to teach some classes using low carb flours. And what I noticed was their rate of hydration was slower than wheat flour. So that might be something that you notice. That doesn't mean you need more liquid. It just means that in your handling of it, it might take a little bit more mixing to push that liquid through to make your dough, to make your bread, whatever you're making.
All right, a good starting point, something to think about. Let's move into another substitution question from Pamela here. Looking forward to this as I've enjoyed my classes with you, Colette. Pamela wants to know, what is castor sugar and is there a substitute?
Castor sugar is pretty much a chunkier, all right. It's like our granulated sugar. But in the United Kingdom and Australia, if you follow the Great British Bake Off or the Australian one, the UK, we'll just call it the UK. Instead of saying granulated sugar, they'll call for castor sugar. The grind is a little thicker, but what we would use, what the sub is granulated for us here in the United States. I mean, you can find it and then you would just use it. But that is pretty much, and then just to piggyback onto that, might as well answer the elephant question in the room. Those recipes so castor sugar is very similar to granulated sugar. If you see icing sugar in a recipe, they're talking about powdered sugar. Great, we cleared that up.
We're doing a little bit of translation here today. Oh, we've got a very general question here coming in from Patty. We're going to let some secrets out here with this one. So, Colette, what is the secret to nice, flaky pie crust?
Oh, I was afraid it was a personal question. But something about my husband's or something. But anyway, the secret to nice, flaky pie crust is mixing just enough, and this is going to sound like the Goldilocks school of baking, mixing just enough, and then, just like we do for croissants and Danish, giving it 2 quick tri-folds, and this is what I demoed this in the November demo that we did, just giving it 2 tri-folds back to back, one right after the other, and then chilling it will build in an unbelievable amount of flake. And then also using the bowl scraper, like a regular plastic bowl scraper, plastic, not nylon or silicone, because they're too floppy, is you're literally folding the flour and water together using the side of the bowl, and as you're mixing, naturally building in layers. So actually doing that, again, we really had a great demo in November. And if you haven't had a chance to watch it, please, it's on the Craftsy platform. If you put my name in the space bar, it will come up, and you can ask questions, if they come up in the moment as well.
Okay, and I just had seen a question here, our next one from Laura, asking about using almond and coconut flour with regular flour or all-purpose flour when baking. Do you have suggestions on how to manage that?
Yes. You'll have similar results if you keep the percentage of coconut and almond flour to 20 to 25%. If you want to remove it, it really does depend on what you're making, but that's kind of a good rule of thumb. If you want to introduce what I call alternative flours, keep the percentage 20 to 25%, and then that other 80 to 75 would be your all-purpose flour. Because again, wheat flour is the only flour that provides those two proteins that create gluten that give our baked goods structure.
Okay, let's move on to a question from Pat. Pat would like to experiment with combining lard and butter. If you think that would work, what percentage of each would you recommend?
Great question. Oh, lard is really exciting because it really makes a flaky pastry. But the flavor of butter is, I don't want to say it's better, but the flavor of butter is very pleasing. So maybe 1/3 lard, lard, and then 2/3 butter. And make sure when you cut the lard into your pastry, it's very cold.
Okay, that is hopefully helpful for using those two together. Let's go to Jody's question next. What are your thoughts about glass or Pyrex pie baking dishes?
Oh,
My understanding is that metal pans are better at conducting heat.
yeah, I have many opinions about Pyrex dishes. I mean, we love them, right? The benefit of a Pyrex pie dish is that we can see the color of our bottom crust. It's not a mystery. We don't have to take it out of the oven, close the oven door, and sort of try to peek at it, right? If you're curious about, we always want like a beautiful golden brown crust color on the bottom of our pie. So the drawback is that you're right, it doesn't conduct heat as well as metal, but it gives us that window into our crust color. And technically, we should be baking our Pyrex at a slightly lower temperature than a metal pan. That's what they prefer, but I usually bake them at the same temperature. I've never had one break on me, but there's always a first time. And I'm fearless, so you don't have to be. But quite honestly, for just no question, beautiful crust color, a regular traditional aluminum pan is going to be your best bet. And not the disposable ones. I mean, we use them because we have to sometimes, you guys, but a traditional pie pan is going to probably give you the best results. Ceramic, oh my God, they're beautiful, but oh my God.
I can tell you have some opinions about these.
It's hard really just with ceramic, hard to get that crust color.
Mm-hmm.
Heat conduction is just not the same. And the pastry sits at a weird warm temperature before the baking processes kick in. And that's what's so difficult.
All right. Well, hopefully that's helpful if you're out there trying to make a decision on what to use. Oh, here's a good question for anybody that is getting into the holiday baking here. Doreen is asking if there is a standard change to make to Christmas cookie recipes for people that are baking at high altitudes. Think like 6,000 feet.
What you want to do is reduce whatever is the chemical leavener in the recipe, and there may not be one. But if there's baking powder in the recipe, you want to reduce that by about 10%. So, for example, which may mean, so let's do that. That sounded a little technical, and would probably require like a tenth of gram scale. So let's just do it this way. If the recipe would call for a teaspoon of baking powder, I would take out a quarter if I was baking at high altitude. But again, so that would be something that you would want to change. If there is no chemical leavener with something like a Christmas cookie or a sugar cookie, you're fine. And I can say this emphatically because we filmed in Denver all the classes on the Craftsy platform, and I know exactly where I ran in. That's 800 feet lower. Yeah, so not too far. And I only got in trouble one time, and that was with the Madeline class in French dessert miniatures or miniature French desserts. That was a nightmare. So I know.
All right, let's get a little more specific with our next question. What is the problem when a pot au choux for eclairs collapse right out of the oven, but cream puffs don't?
Huh. That's a baking time issue. So
Mhm.
that means if they collapse, well, it could be two things. It could mean too much egg added to the pâte à choux in mixing. It's too liquid. It'll rise a little bit and then it'll collapse. But that's probably a baking time issue. And that is because pâte à choux needs to be baked until it's an overall golden brown color. And what happens is many recipes and formulas, many recipes will give a baking time. And it's the first time we've made it or first time using that recipe. And when we're baking at home, we tend to pull things out of the oven when it's recommended, but everybody's oven is different. So that pâte à choux needs to be baked longer. I suspect if the cream puff is a smaller unit, that it might bake a little quicker, and also the shape of it, the way heat circulates around it, it might get heat more quickly. So that's why you notice you're having better luck with cream puffs than eclairs with their longer shape. But the trick is to bake them long enough. Even if you have to bake them at even if you bake them at the recommended temperature for X amount of time, then drop the temperature 25 or so degrees, maybe even 50, and let them dry out in the oven so that they'll hold their shape. And old school bakers, this is super old school, it predates me, but there used to be a theory that once your pâte à choux was pretty much baked, like you poke it with a cake tester and let some of that steam out, and that helps them hold their shape after they're done fully baking. I'm not a big fan of this one, but with the internet and blogs, some of these old, you might read some crazy stuff, um, but that's another option if you're really having trouble. And again, if you can, I'm happy to look at photographs too, and that I love solving baking problems. It's like my thing.
Well, perfect. We're going to solve another one right now. Marion is asking if she has cream and 1% milk, how can I make the equivalent of half and half?
Just put them together.
Ta-da!
It'll have a little bit less, so 50-50. It'll have a little bit less butterfat content with the 1% milk, but it will work. It will work fine. It'll work fine.
All right, now I'm going to mix a couple questions that I've seen come in about butter here, and I'm going to put them all to you right now, Colette. So we have some questions about plant-based versus regular butter. We have some questions about the water content in store-bought butter being slightly different than you might get elsewhere, and then also the difference between salted and unsalted. So if you want to just take a moment and let us know your thoughts on butter choices and what's appropriate for certain things, I think that would help quite a few viewers out there.
Oh, Leah, I could talk about butter till 4 o'clock this afternoon, but I won't, but I could definitely. All right. So keep me grounded. I'm going to try to hit them one, two, three. So
Okay.
plant-based butter, definitely totally usable, but it must say on the label baking sticks. If it doesn't say or suitable for baking or something, because what you want to avoid is a spread. A spread will have too much moisture in it. And so what happens is your product will definitely, it will spread. Cookies, you'll get the cookie pizza and all those things that we as bakers dread. So plant-based, fine. I have, not to plug Earth Balance, though they do put out a great product. I've had my best luck with Earth Balance, and now I will try the other one, the Mykonos one, and form an opinion on that one. All right, unsalted versus salted butter. Let's clear that right now. So, salt was added to butter historically as a preservative. With modern refrigeration and transport, we no longer needed to salt our butter, but we got used to the flavor of it. So it's still sold in markets today. Years ago, and I remember this as a young baker when I would pour over, baking books and just bake my heart out. You would read bakers would say, oh, if you're using salted butter, take the salt out of the recipe, which I did, and I couldn't figure out why things tasted a little weird. Now, now that I have the knowledge and the training and the teaching and blah, 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 never, that's not an option for us. And the reason it's not an option, we can't remove all the salt because the salt has functions in every recipe, and the salt in our butter is trapped in the fat. There's no way it's going to swim out and then do what it needs to do for our bread, for our cookies, for our pie crust, whatever we're doing. So, if you're absolutely stuck with salted butter, reduce the salt slightly in the recipe, but don't take it out completely. And then just a quick piggyback, we use unsalted butter because it supports other flavors. If it is the star flavor, it has a pure grassy flavor, whereas baking with salted butter, unless the recipe is specifically using salted butter, and I can only think of two items that sometimes do that. That's Queen Amman, the beautiful pastry, and then there's a cookie out of Brittany, France, that specifies called Breton something en français that specifies salted butter. So I hope that helps. There's a really clear reason why we want good unsalted butter in our baking, and it's because it's such a good supporter of other flavors without the weird flavor of extra salt. And as when it's on its own, it can function as a true star. Think like Betty Davis and Joan Crawford. Okay. Now, last, I think I'm on track, Leah. We need to talk fat content.
Yes.
All right. Deep yoga breath. In the United States and in the European Union, by law, butter must be 80% butter fat content to be sold. All right, that's USDA, and in Europe, they're USDA. So any butter you're pulling off your supermarket shelf or wherever you shop is at least 80%. That will function for any baking recipe. Now, When we get into recipes like laminated doughs or pie doughs, we can use a higher fat butter content. And usually, this isn't off the charts, you guys. Usually, it's only no more than 2 to 3% more butter fat content if we buy a Plugra, if we buy like a Land O'Lakes European or a Kerrygold. It's just a little bit more percentage higher, but it can give you more depth of flavor. So, but again, last thing. And if you're using a recipe where butter is the star, spend up, invest in those higher butter fat content butters, especially once you've nailed that technique. But if you're doing a recipe like brownies or buttercream that's loaded with sugar and chocolate and other flavors, don't bother. Use your favorite regular butter and spend your money on a nicer chocolate or we all have those things, that we all have those ingredients that we like to spend up on, and that's where you can put that extra, because once you add those other ingredients on top of it, you're not going to taste the subtleties of that European butter.
All right. So there are a lot of you out there that had questions about butter. I hope that was a really great shortened version. And yes, Colette, you stayed right on.
When I host SNL, I'm going to do the monologue on butter.
Yes. Okay, we're going to Terry's question next. Terry has a candy recipe I want to try, Kahlua Bites, and it calls for toasted flour. How does one toast flour?
What a great question. What you're going to do is you're going to take a baking tray, put a piece of parchment down, and then you're going to sprinkle the flour on a single layer on your tray, and then you're going to toast it at 350 degrees for no more, check it in 5 minutes, and it should smell nutty. It may take as long as 7. I hate to give baking times, but it's definitely going to be under 10. And the key is that nutty smell. Once you get that, it might turn a little bit pale tan, but that nutty smell is the key. And the reason I know this, and I can say this so emphatically, that I taught in culinary school for about 15 years, and we would have students toast flour to make roux when we were doing sauce making classes. So I feel like since from that, I have a PhD in toasting flour.
It's a very specific PhD. I like it. Now, I know you just mentioned that you don't like to talk specific baking times, but this question is about convection or regular oven. So Jan wants to know which one you recommend for baking breads and pastry, and do you have to adjust the bake time one to the other?
Yes. So convection baking is great. It doesn't mean you have to go out and buy a convection oven to bake well, although I have, but that's just my craziness. I do not have a convection oven now, and I'm producing beautiful things out of my very simple oven. So it's not necessary. If you have one though, use it. And you're going to reduce the temperature 25 degrees. Your baking time may be slightly less. So do that initial check, shave off 5 minutes. Let's talk quickly about what convection baking does. In a convection oven, there's a fan in the back of the oven. And that fan allows heat to circulate more evenly and more quickly around your product. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen in a conventional oven, but it's faster in a convection oven. Now, if you were to go to a restaurant supply store, the salesman would tell you emphatically that your baking time will be reduced 33%. Yes, in a commercial oven, but because the fan is bigger, it's about the size of a dinner plate. In our home ovens, it's about the size of a bread and butter plate. So we don't shave off that much time, but we do reduce by 25%. And In your home, in your residential convection oven, convection roast can be a higher fan than convection bake. So you want to make sure that you're going to convection bake. All right. God, anything else, Leah, about that?
That was good on that one. So good. In fact, I think I'm going to send another two-parter your way.
All
I'm going
right.
to combine two questions that came in about lemon meringue pies.
Oh,
Yes. So one question was just about how to avoid allowing the pie to be weepy on the second day. And another question that's coming in general, I made lemon meringue and the bottom was flimsy and not set. Do you have any suspicions on what went wrong? Didn't put it in the fridge, let it set for hours.
okay. Okay. So that's a two-parter. You
Yes.
know, I'm going to be honest with you guys. Lemon meringue is one of the most difficult pies to nail. And it comes and goes in popularity, and it's having an upswing. Maybe it'll trend for 2020. But the problem with the meringue in particular is that their sugar is hygroscopic. It attracts moisture, and there's moisture in the environment. So once we get it out of the oven, it begins to pull moisture from the air. So that's why it's and we have to put it in the refrigerator. So that's why second day, it's always weepy. Now, our good friends at Cooks Illustrated stabilize their meringue with a little bit of cornstarch. And this makes great sense. Cornstarch acts as a dryer and it inhibits the sugar attracting moisture. So I would definitely do a little look at the Cook's Illustrated recipe. Um, uh, and then the other question was about the filling not setting. If it didn't set during baking, then something is off with that formula. Because a lemon meringue pie should be able to set at room temperature. So I would really wonder about. I'd love to see that recipe, and then I could do baker's percentages on it, and I could diagnose what's going on. I really could. So if there's some way that could happen, yeah.
All right, well, let's move on to another common question. So, there are a lot of people out here curious about gluten-free baking. They have friends they're baking for or family members that just cannot have gluten. So, curious about what your recommended substitutes would be. There are some people that are having some texture inconsistencies. So, any recommendations you have for gluten-free baking and pastry baking, all of that good stuff?
Well, first thing I would really recommend. There's a couple good gluten-free baking classes on Craftsy, and Chef Coppage, he is a CMB like I am, and that's certified master baker, which is this really hard thing to go through to get that certification. And his class is super thorough on gluten free. So I have to give a plug to him just for really good background. But then, from my point of view, I've just completed doing a gluten free bread class for the online culinary school that I work for. So this is like really foremost in my brain. Number one, you will have texture there. It is not going to be the same. It will be close to wheat flour. We can get very, very close, but it will be slightly different. There can be a grittiness. You'll also notice that gluten-free breads and some pastries, I feel cakes are the most successful. They will stale more rapidly. So it almost needs to be consumed within a day or within a day, 24 hours before those changes really kick in. Also, tailor your flours. In developing that program, I used every gluten-free blend on the market. And also, that's the thing about the class on Craftsy. Chef Coppage goes through blending your own GF, let's call it GF blend. But for example, for breads, Bob's Red Mill Stronger Gluten-Free, I had off the chart results with pizza dough. When I had to develop laminated doughs, there's a company called GF Jules, Jules, and their blend, available by mail order only, was excellent for pastries and laminated doughs. For cookies and cakes, King Arthur's gluten-free and cup for cup worked very well for me. And this was very stringent testing, doing these recipes over and over again to get them right so they could go into the program. So you have, in a nutshell, tailor your flour to your product, your gluten-free flour, and then really make sure when you look at blogs and videos that your instructor is really credible in gluten-free and not just guessing. And that's why that one Craftsy class I feel is so credible and cogent.
Okay, we'll move on to another question here. We have time for 2, maybe 3 more questions, so I'm going to slide them in quick. First, Colette, what is the best way to proof dough in a cold house?
Oh, I'll try to be snappy. Okay. Those of you who have taken my croissant and laminated dough classes, you know that I am in love with Ziploc XL bags. It's a food grade plastic, and you can buy them Target, Walmart, Amazon has them. The thing about this, it's large enough to put a bowl of dough, and then you can zip this big bag shut. And then in there with it, you put a big coffee mug or a Pyrex measure half full of boiling water. Because here's the thing, we don't have proof boxes at home. And there's a ton of information and almost, I don't mean this wrong, but sort of old school opinions, like using your oven. God, in the 70s, I remember as a kid, people were advocating the top of the dishwasher. I mean, good Lord, like there's a lot of insanity. But what I like about these bags is you can get them for under $10. You get 4. You can reuse them, and because we dry them out and then let them dry overnight, so there no weirdness grows in them, and it's my favorite way. And then we can control, basically, it'll be about 80 degrees in your bag. And if your house is very cold, just change out the water maybe every 30 minutes to keep it warm. There is a very good commercial proofer made by, I want to say, Broad and Taylor, and you can temperature control it, but it only works for your dough. It's not big enough for your baking tray. So I hope that helps.
Okay, let's finish with this one. Another general one, but we're coming up on the holidays, and I'm sure a lot of people might be delivering pastries or storing pastries. So this is a really good one to finish on. Colette, what would you recommend as the best way to store pastries?
Well, it depends, airtight, and it depends, and that goes for if they're refrigerated or not. So, something kind of like, try to avoid storing in a cardboard box, like this is another old school thing. I just mentioned the 70s, but there's a reason that Tupperware sold so well and probably still sells so something where you can snap out the air is great. And then also, I feel like a Ziploc commercial, I always do, but Ziploc freezer bags work very well for storing our product, not only just in the freezer. As a matter of fact, when we were interviewing Ann York last month for she talked about storing cookies and cookie doughs. She talked about how she slid cookie dough and even her baked cookies into Ziploc freezer bags and stored them either in the fridge or the freezer. So a couple ideas for you guys. Just avoid, I mean, there's always going to be some air. We can't vacuum pack stuff. That doesn't work. But we want to keep the excess air to a minimum.
All right. Well, with that said, I'm going to send it back to Colette for any final thoughts, anything that came to you, Colette, that you want to leave with us before we sign off for the end of the event. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I just want to apologize if I was at all too long-winded, because I can go on and on and on. But I just hope that some of these tips really help with your holiday baking, because I believe that the better we bake, the more we bake, and the more we enjoy, not, better in that we have successful outcomes. So if we have more successful outcomes, we bake more, and baking makes life sweet. So let's just keep on doing it. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Happy holidays and happy baking.
With that said, I would also like to thank you for joining us today and for bringing your incredible questions forward for our chef, Colette. There is a live Craftsy Chat every month with a new instructor, so be sure to stay tuned and see what we have prepared for you in 2021. Thank you to Craftsy, thank you to Chef Colette, and of course, thank you to you for tuning in. And as always, take care of yourselves until our next live event. We will see you then.